A deadly storm tears through a vulnerable town, but the real disaster begins after the skies clear. Jasmine Crockett uncovers a shocking policy decision by Stephen Miller. Prioritize rescue for the wealthy and leave struggling families behind. As emotional testimonies collide with cold data in a nationally televised hearing, one leaked recording changes everything. A child's question, a mother's silence, and a line no one expected to hear spark outrage across the country. When survival becomes selective, who gets chosen and who gets left to drown? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under a bruised gray sky, Hurricane Evelyn made landfall with Category 5 fury, its winds shredding roofs like paper and floodwaters swallowing entire blocks of Bay Ridge, a low-lying working-class town where over 80% of residents were Black or Latino. The storm didn't discriminate, but the aftermath did. Within 48 hours, federal rescue teams began arriving, but not in Bay Ridge. They bypassed the town entirely, setting up aid stations in affluent nearby suburbs with waterfront condos and golf courses, areas that somehow sustained far less damage. Bay Ridge, meanwhile, was left to rot in silence, its residents wading chest-deep in contaminated water, waving makeshift flags from rooftops, begging for help that never came. For 5 straight days, families lined up outside a shuttered post office turned temporary supply depot, waiting for trucks that never arrived. Local news outlets captured the desperation, mothers rationing infant formula by the spoonful, seniors collapsed on lawn chairs under plastic tarps, children wandering barefoot through debris. Water was scarce, power non-existent. One report from the Bay Ridge Ledger showed a line stretching 6 blocks for canned goods, only to be turned away because the shipment was reallocated. When asked where the reallocation went, officials offered no answer. Just protocol, just numbers. But the numbers didn't add up. Not for Bay Ridge. Jasmine Crockett wasn't scheduled to be there. She wasn't on a committee, wasn't part of any formal response team. But when she watched a grainy cell phone video of a young girl weeping beside a submerged car with her grandmother trapped inside, something in her cracked. She flew in without announcement, walked through the flooded avenues in boots and a rain-slick coat, and listened. Residents told her the same story again and again. Aid diverted, no information. National Guard trucks rolling through but never stopping. One woman whispered that someone high up in the state had said Bay Ridge wasn't worth the recovery cost. That was the moment Jasmine stopped asking questions and started pulling threads. Because if a storm tore through a city and only the poor were left to drown, someone, somewhere, made that choice. But the silence from Washington was soon broken. Not by grief, not by urgency, but by a podium, a smirk, and a doctrine disguised as order. Inside the Capitol's East Wing press gallery, with polished brass rails and the scent of fresh ink in the air, Stephen Miller emerged like a man unveiling a victory, not answering for a humanitarian crisis. Standing beneath the American flag and the seal of the Department of Homeland Infrastructure Recovery, he adjusted the microphone, then looked out over the crowd with a calm so unnerving it seemed rehearsed. Reconstruction, he began, voice smooth and clipped, must be effective, targeted, and future-oriented. We cannot throw taxpayer resources into failed systems. We must invest in individuals who represent long-term stability. With a click of his remote, a massive LED screen behind him lit up with bold white text. The Priority Reconstruction Act, a name that sounded benign but masked something far colder. Below the title were 3 qualifying pillars: no criminal record, high credit score, full tax compliance for the past 5 years. Gas rippled through the room like an aftershock. But Miller continued, voice steady. These are not punishments. They are benchmarks. America has limited hands. We must lend them to those most prepared to rebuild, not those statistically more likely to fall again. The language was sterile, but its intent was radioactive. Miller framed it as logic, draped it in data, shielded it with policy jargon, but every word was an indictment against the poor. And it wasn't subtle. With his eyes locked on the teleprompter, he spoke of fiscal resiliency and behavioral risk models, invoking economics like scripture. What he never mentioned, not once, was race. He didn't have to. In Bay Ridge, where over 80% of the population were people of color, where historic underfunding had left residents with broken schools, subprime loans, and under-the-table employment, these benchmarks weren't guidelines. They were gates, locked, sealed, guarded by credit scores and IRS filings. A mother who worked 2 jobs in cash wouldn't qualify. A black teenager with a nonviolent misdemeanor, disqualified. A retired veteran with back taxes, rejected. Miller's press team nodded along as if these people were footnotes in someone else's future. And yet it was Miller's final line that cleaved through the air like a blade. Compassion is not incompatible with accountability, but it must never override it. That sentence, cold, unyielding, clean, would later be quoted in thousands of protest signs. But in that moment, in that room, it sat undisturbed, like a warning shot fired at no one in particular, but meant for millions. Back in her D.C. office, Jasmine Crockett stared at the press conference feed, fists clenched at her side. Not because she was surprised, but because he had finally said it out loud. The system wasn't broken, it was being perfected, not to save lives, but to sort them. And Bay Ridge had just been sorted into the discard pile. And as Miller descended from the podium with his chin high and his doctrine unchallenged, the aftershocks of his policy didn't wait. They struck, not in the language of legislation, but in the ragged final breaths of those left behind. Horace Freeman had survived segregation, 2 wars, and a lifetime of underpaid labor cleaning classrooms that had never taught his history, but he couldn't survive the heat. 82 years old, diabetic, oxygen-dependent, and proud, he was bused from Bay Ridge to a so-called temporary care shelter in a vacant school gymnasium with no air conditioning and 40 cots jammed wall to wall. On the 3rd night, as the outside temperature reached 101 degrees, the generator sputtered and died. There was no backup. The oxygen tank beside him emptied with a soft hiss no one noticed until it was too late. When volunteers tried calling for help, the line forwarded them to a central dispatch in a wealthier county. The response? That facility is designated Tier 3. We have higher risk zones prioritized. Horace's lips were blue when they found him. His file had been stamped, non-priority evacuee. It was bureaucracy that killed him. Bureaucracy wrapped in a smiling press release. Elsewhere in the flooded heart of Bay Ridge, Rosa Morales, 24, undocumented, unmarried, uninsured, went into early labor inside a 1-room apartment lit only by candles. She had been told 2 days earlier she didn't qualify for shelter admittance due to insufficient ID documentation. Her baby girl Camilla was born alive but struggling. Rosa ran to the nearest aid station, banging on the locked doors of an abandoned firehouse where FEMA had once set up. She screamed for an ambulance. A neighbor dialed 911. The call went through. But after a brief pause, the dispatcher replied, "That zone is on hold. Reassessment pending." Rosa sank to her knees, holding Camilla to her chest as the baby's cries grew thinner, then stopped. By the time help arrived, it wasn't help. It was the coroner. No one logged the call as urgent. No one flagged the death. No one apologized. Because in the data fields where the baby should have mattered, there was no tax ID, no voting record, no credit history. Just a mother's scream against a wall that would never answer. 3 days later, Jasmine Crockett stood before a tangle of press microphones outside the Capitol steps. Her voice calm but sharpened to a razor's edge. She didn't open with condolences. She opened with names. "Horace Freeman," she began, holding up a photo of the elder man in his army uniform, "Rosa Morales, and her daughter Camilla. These are not victims of a natural disaster. They are victims of a man-made hierarchy that placed worth on a ledger before it placed boots on the ground." Her tone grew colder with every word. They didn't die in the eye of the storm. They died in the shadow of a government that decided who deserved to survive. She let the silence sit, taut and electric. Then she pointed toward the Capitol dome behind her and delivered the blow. This wasn't chaos. This was calculus. Every denial, every delay, every reallocation, it was done by choice. And choice, when it kills the poor to serve the powerful, is no longer policy. It's violence. No one clapped. No one moved. Because Jasmine hadn't given a statement. She had issued a moral indictment, and the room felt the verdict. But Jasmine's words didn't just echo through the television broadcasts and digital streams. They pierced deeper, slipping past public relations filters and into the stillness of locked offices, unopened inboxes, and conscience-heavy desks. Somewhere in the machinery of quiet complicity, a seam tore open. Someone who had sat through too many closed-door meetings, who had watched too many decisions masked as metrics, could no longer sit silently. 3 days after Jasmine's fiery press conference, her office receptionist found a manila envelope wedged beneath the door before sunrise. No postage, no return address. Just a short handwritten message on a torn scrap of legal paper. You were right. They're not hiding it. They published it internally. Inside the envelope was a stack of documents. The top one, a large full-color map of the Gulf Coast, stamped with a watermark reading, "For internal, strategic use only." It looked more like a zoning proposal than anything related to emergency response. But Jasmine's instincts turned cold the moment she began to unfold it. The map wasn't about rescue routes or shelter allocations. It was a triage system, not for medical needs, but for neighborhoods, for people. The map was shaded in colors: green for highest priority, yellow for moderate interest, and deep red for non-viable zones. It didn't take a sociologist to interpret the pattern. The green zones were all familiar: affluent suburbs, beachfront communities, and downtown districts packed with corporate offices, private hospitals, and recently renovated infrastructure. These areas were marked with glowing terms like rapid recovery pipeline approved, immediate infrastructure redeployment, and rebuild certification granted. In other words, they were to be restored, protected, and invested in. But as Jasmine traced her fingers down toward the lower regions of the storm zone, the palette turned hostile. The red zones, overwhelmingly concentrated in working-class, majority Black and Latino neighborhoods, were branded with language that made her jaw clench: low return to investment probability, community maintenance burden, and most chillingly, not recommended for long-term reinvestment. The town of Bay Ridge, the very place where bodies were still being pulled from homes and where children slept on collapsed porches, was circled in red. Handwritten beside it in a slanted clinical scrawl were 4 words: clearance suggested, demographic deprioritized. Jasmine stood in the center of her office, the map wide in her arms, as if it were physically too heavy to carry. Her breath slowed, her hands trembled. She didn't blink for several seconds. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't bureaucracy fumbling in a crisis. It was a decision, made not during the storm, but likely months or years before it, refined through models, approved in silence, and hidden behind vague phrases like efficiency and cost-effectiveness. What she held wasn't recovery strategy. It was an erasure plan, a sterilized act of abandonment pre-justified by spreadsheets. The other documents in the envelope were equally damning: minutes from internal meetings, presentation slides titled Community Reclamation Forecasting, and bullet point memos outlining criteria for where not to allocate rebuilding funds. One note read, "Consider alternate use for low-yield flood zones pending vacancy." Another included a list of neighborhoods flagged for potential land reallocation partnerships with unnamed development firms. Bay Ridge appeared 5 times, and each mention excluded words like relief or rescue. It was as if the residents had never been people, only barriers to profitability. By the time the sun rose, Jasmine had called her chief of staff, her legal counsel, and 3 journalists she trusted with her life. Within 24 hours, the map and supporting documents, redacted only to protect the identity of the whistleblower, were distributed to every major investigative outlet in the country. Within hours, the images were everywhere: online forums, national newspapers, televised reports. Editorials called it a scandal that weaponized natural disaster to complete unfinished gentrification. Community leaders called it a betrayal of moral governance. Civil rights lawyers used harsher words: a deliberate policy of displacement through neglect. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People filed an emergency petition demanding immediate oversight and full public disclosure of all internal disaster response criteria. Human rights organizations from around the world issued statements of alarm. One read, "No legitimate government should determine which communities deserve to be saved based on their wealth or demographic makeup. This is not restoration. It is a controlled collapse of equity." City councils in multiple states, both Democratic and Republican, began to request congressional hearings. The Federal Oversight Committee, caught in the whirlwind, could no longer pretend neutrality. Their message, sent 2 days later, was short and dry. A preliminary hearing will be scheduled. Documentation accepted. Testimony to follow. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't sigh. She simply picked up the original map again, circled the phrase "not recommended for reinvestment" in black ink, and taped it to the glass wall behind her desk. She didn't need to say it aloud. The message was seared into every page, every pixel, every word she now carried into battle. This wasn't about fixing a system that failed. It was about tearing down a system that was designed to. And when the hearing was finally scheduled, the storm didn't just shift to Washington. It exploded under the marble dome of power. Room 1100 of the Capitol had never felt so claustrophobic. The air was thick with heat from the overhead lights, the tension of a nation watching in real time. Every seat was filled. Lawmakers, aides, media crews, survivors. Outside, a crowd surged behind barricades, chanting, holding up photos of drowned homes and lost children. Inside, cameras from every major news outlet were trained on the witness table, where Stephen Miller sat like a man untouched by the gravity of the moment. He was unflinching, his tailored suit unwrinkled, his eyes scanning the room with calculated detachment. Before him were 3 thick binders and a small placard that read Special Advisor to the Office of National Recovery Strategy, a title that sounded clinical, sanitized, weaponized. When his turn came, Miller stood without hesitation and stepped toward the microphone with a slow, deliberate calm. "Ladies and gentlemen of this committee," he began, flipping open a binder with the ease of someone presenting quarterly earnings, not defending the fallout of human suffering. "Our response model is guided by one unshakable principle: fiscal efficiency." He clicked a remote, and behind him, a massive screen came to life, displaying graphs, zone charts, and budget allocations color-coded by cost-benefit ratios. "This was not a question of compassion," he continued, "but capacity. We had to deploy resources where the economic return on recovery was highest. Not because we wanted to, but because we had to." Gas whispered across the room. He didn't flinch. As he spoke, the images shifted. Green highlighted suburbs with high-income indexes, comparison bar graphs labeled "recovery investment versus property yield," and then, without irony, a slide labeled "low return zones." "Deferred support pending review." Jasmine's eyes locked on that title like a loaded gun. She could feel the weight of every family sitting behind her. The mothers of lost infants, the children holding framed photos of grandparents, the men in union jackets whose neighborhoods had been left to rot. And yet Miller pressed on. "We applied consistent metrics," he said coolly. "This was never about race or politics. It was about numbers, and the numbers made the decisions for us." But while Miller stood cloaked in data, in charts and ratios, in polished economic jargon, Jasmine Crockett stood in something far less abstract, something that bled, something that buried its dead without headstones or headlines. She didn't ask permission to speak. She rose with a stillness so complete, it silenced the room more effectively than any gavel. In her hands was a thin black folder, scuffed at the corners, clasped shut with a single elastic band. She walked forward, heels echoing against the chamber floor. Each step a declaration. When she reached the witness table, she laid the folder down. Slowly, without a word, she unfastened the band and pulled out a single photograph, then another, then another. She spread them across the table like evidence at a crime scene, because that's what they were. A little boy no older than 7, curled into a fetal position on a wet concrete floor, wrapped in a tattered towel, eyes swollen from dehydration. An elderly woman with oxygen tubing draped limply across her chest, her mouth open, her eyes glazed, slumped against a shelter cot that had no mattress. A young mother, barefoot, cradling a limp infant in her arms, her face pressed against the child's cheek as if willing her to breathe. The images were raw, unedited, unsparing, and every flashbulb in the room caught the tension as lawmakers leaned forward, lips tightening, hearts faltering. These weren't symbols. These were names. These were people who had once asked for help and been told by omission and algorithm that they weren't worth it. Then Jasmine spoke, not with rage, but with something far sharper, truth that refused to be softened. "Mr. Miller," she began, voice calm but coiled, "I'm sure your formulas accounted for square footage, for property values, for projected return on infrastructure spending." She paused, resting a hand gently on the photo of the child. "But tell me, what variable did you use to measure the sound a child makes when he begs for water, and no one comes?" She turned the next photo toward him. "What line in your spreadsheet corresponds to the final breath of an 82-year-old woman when the generator fails and no ambulance is sent?" And then she lifted the final photo, her voice lowering but hardening like tempered steel. "What number, Mr. Miller, measures the scream of a mother when her newborn dies in her arms because her address didn't qualify for priority aid?" She stepped back, allowing the silence to settle like ash across the room. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "You talk about economic efficiency. You talk about fiscal logic. But I want to know, what is the return on a mother's grief?" She let the question hang there, suspended above them like a weight no one could lift. And for the first time since the hearing began, Miller had no chart, no ratio, no answer. And just when the weight of Jasmine's question had begun to suffocate the chamber, when the final photo still lingered on the table like a wound refusing to close, she stepped forward with one last weapon, his own voice. The night before, her legal team had received a secure, encrypted message from a federal employee who refused to give a name, but signed the email with 3 words: "You deserve the truth." Attached was a 33-second audio clip. No explanation, no redactions, no edits, just raw, unfiltered sound. The kind that doesn't stutter, doesn't perform, doesn't expect to be heard. Jasmine had played it 7 times, once to verify its authenticity, twice to confirm the timestamp, 4 times to steady herself. It was Stephen Miller. The tone was calm. The room in the background was quiet. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a belief spoken plainly in a meeting not meant for the public. "If they don't pay significant taxes," he said, voice as smooth as glass, "then they don't generate value worth retaining." That sentence didn't merely cross a line. It exposed the entire map. Now, standing before the full hearing room, Jasmine didn't ask for drama. She asked for permission. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice slow and measured, "I would like to submit an audio clip into the official record, provided voluntarily by a whistleblower from the Office of National Recovery." The chairman blinked, then nodded once. "You may proceed." She turned to the technician. "Play it, no cuts." The room fell into a silence that felt unnatural, not empty but charged, like a storm about to crack. Then the recording played. The first sound was Miller's unmistakable cadence, brisk and direct. "Look, if they don't pay significant taxes, they don't generate value worth retaining." There was no ambiguity, no room for context or defense. He didn't say help. He didn't say serve. He said retain, as if people were inventory, as if struggling Americans were cost centers to be trimmed, as if grief was just a variable on a spreadsheet. For a few seconds after the recording ended, no one spoke. The silence wasn't still. It vibrated. Aides paused mid-note. One reporter dropped a pen. A congresswoman from Louisiana covered her mouth. And in the gallery, someone audibly whispered, "My God." It wasn't just a damning line. It was a philosophy laid bare. Jasmine turned toward the cameras. Not to the committee, not to Miller, but directly into the lens now broadcasting into homes, waiting rooms, shelters, classrooms. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped lower, heavier, sharper. "We are not rebuilding cities," she said. "We are recalibrating the worth of human life based on financial output. You heard it. Not from me, from him. This isn't about resources. It's about return. This isn't about rescue. It's about revenue. She took a step forward, her face illuminated by the hearing lights but shadowed by the weight of what had just been heard. He didn't say they were unreachable. He said they weren't worth keeping. And with that, the myth of impartial governance collapsed, not with an accusation, but with confession. His, public, permanent, unforgivable. And just as the final syllable of Jasmine's indictment settled into the wood-paneled silence of room 1100, Stephen Miller straightened in his seat and delivered what he must have rehearsed 100 times in front of a mirror. A calculated pivot dressed in outrage. "The recording you just heard," he began, tone clipped and surgical, "was taken grotesquely out of context." His eyes didn't flinch, but the corners of his mouth tightened slightly, betraying the strain beneath the surface. It was a private internal discussion regarding risk models and resource logistics, not a reflection of public policy, and certainly not of moral judgment. He turned toward the committee, then allowed his gaze to drift to the cameras, and finally to Jasmine herself. "What we are witnessing today is not a pursuit of truth," he said coldly. "It is the weaponization of suffering. Congresswoman Crockett has turned tragedy into performance. She is not here to seek justice. She is here to build her brand." A few allies behind him nodded, their pens paused mid-scribble. The game had shifted, and he was playing it as if empathy were an inconvenience to be outmaneuvered. Then came a voice from further down the dais. A congressman aligned with the ruling party, face stern, voice loud enough to carry through marble. "Let's not pretend," he said, leaning into the mic. "Reconstruction isn't charity. It isn't a handout for people who chronically underperform. We need to rebuild where rebuilding has a future, not for those who've proven again and again they can't keep up." The words landed with the weight of a verdict already written. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman's sharp breath broke the silence. Not outrage, not even surprise, just the sound of a heart finally cracking open under the weight of being unseen. Jasmine didn't recoil. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she lowered her eyes for half a beat, then lifted the thick black folder from the table and held it tight to her chest, as if anchoring herself to the weight of every name inside it. She looked up, locking eyes with the congressman first, then turning her gaze slowly toward Miller, who had begun rearranging his notes. Her voice was quieter now, but sharpened. The kind of quiet that demands listening. "You sit there and call them failures," she said, "because that's easier than admitting they were never given a fair chance to succeed." She took a breath, not for effect, but to hold down the rising fire in her throat. "You tell yourselves this isn't about race. This isn't about poverty. This is just math, just policy. But what you're doing is trying to erase the consequences of decisions made by people who look like you, live like you, vote like you, and profit from the very systems that suffocate everyone else." Her grip on the folder tightened, her knuckles white, but her voice never cracked. These people weren't broken. They were bypassed, forgotten, then blamed for it. She stepped forward, placing the folder on the edge of the committee desk, as if daring anyone to open it. "You don't call that failure," she said, her eyes hard. "You call that abandonment, and you call it by its name." And as the weight of her final words hung in the air, "You call that abandonment, and you call it by its name," Jasmine knew that speaking truth wasn't enough. In a room where cruelty wore a tie and called itself policy, she would need to prove intent. She would need to show that what happened in Bay Ridge wasn't the byproduct of overwhelmed systems. It was a strategy cloaked in silence. She turned back to the committee table and picked up a leather folder lined with brass clips. Not the victim testimony binder this time, but a federal report obtained only through the Freedom of Information Act. She had waited to use it, not because she doubted its impact, but because truth, like a blade, cuts deeper when timed precisely. She opened the folder and lifted the first document, holding it up to the overhead projector. The image beamed across the screens behind her. A FEMA situation report dated 72 hours after Hurricane Evelyn made landfall. Its first sentence, in bold black type, "Potential biohazard outbreak risk in Sector Delta, standing water, sewage overflow, medical supply shortages, immediate assessment recommended." Jasmine turned toward the panel. Sector Delta, she said, is Bay Ridge. She flipped to the next page. This time a chain of internal emails between emergency management officials. One read, recommend holding deployment until neighborhood viability is reassessed. Another, no critical infrastructure present. Prioritize high-yield zones. Her voice didn't rise, but it hardened. Stripped of patience, carved into steel. This was not a matter of confusion. It was not chaos. It was prioritization. It was a decision to leave people waiting in floodwater while infection took root in open wounds and silence filled their lungs. Next, she displayed a high-resolution map, layered with red and green directional arrows showing the path of aid convoys. The green arrows snaked in swift lines to communities north of the city, places with higher tax brackets and better road access. The red arrows representing non-deployment zones stopped at a hard perimeter around Bay Ridge. According to this dispatch log, Jasmine said, tapping the screen, 3 different supply convoys rerouted around Bay Ridge. Not because the roads were impassable, but because someone marked this neighborhood non-essential. She looked up, scanning the faces of the committee. Some blinked, some scribbled notes, but a few, the ones who had once applauded Miller's efficiency doctrine, now sat frozen in place. This wasn't logistical, she said, voice steady. It was deliberate, because you don't redraw maps by accident. You don't ignore biohazard warnings by oversight. You don't bypass the sick and the elderly unless you've already decided their survival isn't part of your plan. The room tightened around her words. Even the air felt tense, as if holding its breath for what would come next. Jasmine stepped away from the podium and moved closer to the central mic. She placed both hands on the table, leaned in slightly and let the final document rest flat before her. It was a memo, short, clinical, signed by a deputy official in the Department of Urban Recovery Strategy. The subject line read, Recommendation for Consolidated Clearance Zones, Post-Emergency Development Opportunities. Attached to it was a list of neighborhoods, every one of them low-income, majority Black or Latino, marked as zones of limited return value. Bay Ridge was at the top. Jasmine looked up. No notes in her hand now, no visuals behind her, just her and the truth standing center stage beneath lights that suddenly felt more like interrogation than illumination. You've heard for days that this was a tragedy, she said quietly. But let's be clear. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a tactic. The delay in response was not an accident of red tape or a failure of coordination. It was a policy choice made in backrooms, signed off in memos, and carried out with the precision of a budget plan. She paused, letting that line cut through the noise like a scalpel. Policy choice. It wasn't just negligence anymore. It was premeditated neglect. Then she delivered the line that would headline every paper, ripple through social feeds, and embed itself into the conscience of a nation. Delays like this aren't random, she said. They're structural. They're strategic. And above all, they're sanctioned. This wasn't mismanagement. This was management. This was a government that calculated who could wait and who wouldn't survive the wait. Silence fell like a curtain. Even the cameras seemed to pull back, as if unsure how to frame what had just been laid bare. Across the room, some committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions cracking beneath the weight of undeniable proof. The reporters stopped typing. The aides stopped whispering. Even Stephen Miller, still composed, still staring, was now gripping the edge of the table a little tighter than before. Jasmine stepped back, slowly closing the FOIA folder as if sealing a coffin. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply left the final sentence to hang where it belonged. Not as a closing remark, but as a charge. Delay was not a failure. It was the plan. And after the charts were dismantled, after the maps were exposed and the memos laid bare for the nation to see, Jasmine Crockett knew she had one final truth to deliver, one that couldn't be filed under policy, couldn't be redacted by legal teams, and couldn't be dismissed as data. This one had a voice, a face, a wound that could not be papered over. She stood in the center of the hearing room, her hands folded loosely before her, no longer gripping evidence or exhibits. For the first time that day, she was not armed with documents. She was armed with memory. Her voice, though soft, carried with the weight of every moment that had brought them to this reckoning. I want to close today not with a report, she said, but with a story, one I can't forget, and one I don't think any of us should. She looked out toward the gallery, not the committee. Her eyes settled on a space beyond the cameras, as if seeing something invisible but very, very present. I met a boy in Bay Ridge, she began, and the room shifted. The tension sharpened into stillness. He couldn't have been older than 10. His name was Malik. When I found him, he was sitting on the curb outside what used to be a pharmacy, holding a cracked photo frame against his chest. The glass was gone, just a picture of him and his dad fishing at a lake. I'm sure he'll never visit again. She paused, swallowing hard. His father died 2 days after the storm. Not from the wind, not from the flood, from an infection. A cut on his foot got worse. There was no clean water, no medicine, no ambulance. Just waiting, and then silence. There was no sound in the hearing room now. No coughs, no shifting paper. Just the slow inhale of a country listening not to a statistic, but to its own reflection. Malik didn't cry when he told me, Jasmine continued, her voice a fraction more fragile. He just asked a question. Quietly, he looked up at me and said, if my dad had more money, would they have come sooner? Her breath caught in her throat. She looked down, blinking once, twice, then back up. And I didn't know what to say, because every word I could think of would have been a lie. The moment cracked through the room like thunder. It was not rage. It was not drama. It was the weight of a child's truth hanging in a space built for politics and power, and suddenly made too small to hold it. Jasmine stepped forward again, closer to the microphone, but now she spoke not just to the committee, not just to the gallery, but to the nation watching through the screens. Those in shelters, those in classrooms, those in hospitals still waiting for help that hadn't come. Her voice grew firmer now, richer with fire that only sorrow can forge. When a government starts measuring human worth by a tax return, she said, it's not the economy that's broken, it's the conscience. Her words didn't rise. They deepened, each syllable striking like the toll of a bell. She looked directly at Miller then, not with hatred but with something colder. Clarity. You built a system that knows how to count everything, except what truly matters. You counted homes, you counted budgets, you counted votes, but you didn't count the time a boy spent holding his father's hand, waiting for help that your system decided wasn't worth sending. She turned back to the committee, and her final words came low and slow, like a verdict passed not from law, but from history. We cannot rebuild a country on the backs of the forgotten. We cannot recover if the cost of recovery is compassion. And we must not, let another child ask that question and walk away without an answer. And with that, she stepped back. Not finished, but complete. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was reckoning. And no one, not in that chamber, not in the homes watching, could claim they hadn't heard. And as Jasmine Crockett stepped down from the dais, her final words still burning in the walls, we're not rebuilding cities, we're recalibrating the worth of human life by the thickness of their wallets. Something shifted in the very air of Washington. It was no longer just testimony, it was no longer just politics. It was the precise moment when America's myth of equal protection cracked under the weight of receipts, blood, and silence. And in that crack, something spilled out that couldn't be buried. Not by spin doctors, not by press conferences, not by calculated indifference. Within hours, the recording of the hearing began circulating on every major platform. The segment with Jasmine's final indictment, followed by Miller's damning quote, if they don't pay significant taxes, they don't generate value worth retaining, played on an endless loop across network news, talk radio, and social media. And while the Capitol lights dimmed, the country's fury lit up. Local news anchors broke down. Editorial boards that had once danced around moral language now used words like inhumane, engineered abandonment, and legislated cruelty. The New York Times published a rare front-page editorial. We don't need another policy. We need a reckoning. It came quickly. The morning after the hearing, House speakerphones were jammed. Over 100,000 messages flooded congressional inboxes. They came from across the political spectrum, across geography, across age. Veterans from Arkansas, school teachers from Detroit, retired factory workers from Pennsylvania, clergy from Georgia. Most simply said, don't let this disappear. Outside Capitol Hill, the plaza was no longer just a protest site. It had transformed into something sacred, something volatile. Hundreds stood in silence, holding up waterlogged portraits, ID cards of lost relatives, printed images of blocked relief trucks and flooded bedrooms. Someone painted on cardboard, "Who wasn't profitable enough to save?" By day two, under mounting pressure, the House Oversight Committee made a move rarely seen in modern governance. They authorized the creation of a special independent federal commission to investigate the federal response to Hurricane Evelyn, specifically the strategic withholding of aid to majority Black and Latino communities. The vote was bipartisan, unanimous. The language was sharper than anyone expected. The commission was granted full subpoena power, unfettered access to FEMA logs, Department of Homeland Recovery memoranda, and private contractor communications. And it was given authority to compel a second round of testimony from Stephen Miller, this time under oath, under penalty of perjury, and with the entire nation watching. The headline that night was simple: Stephen Miller ordered to return for testimony, no immunity. The ripple turned to a wave. Within 24 hours, 7 more whistleblowers emerged, some anonymous, some no longer afraid. One of them, a FEMA data analyst from Nevada, confirmed that entire zip codes had been flagged for temporary abandonment pending infrastructure evaluation. Another, a logistics contractor, released screenshots of internal message boards where staff jokingly referred to Bay Ridge as the holding pen. A third, a nurse deployed to a mobile aid station in Texas, claimed she was instructed to keep supplies tight in certain zones and told directly, "Those people have fewer pathways to escalate." National outrage deepened into something more dangerous. Awareness. Suddenly, Americans realized it wasn't just Bay Ridge. It was East Lake in Alabama. It was Southside Phoenix. It was the Ninth Ward. Again, this wasn't just one storm. It was a pattern. Engineered invisibility. Colleges across the country staged coordinated walkouts. Faith leaders published a joint declaration titled, "A Moral Collapse in the Architecture of Aid." High school seniors in Miami marched out of class with duct tape over their mouths and signs that read, "My zip code shouldn't be a death sentence." Talk show hosts wept on air. One Vietnam veteran, now confined to a wheelchair, testified on a local broadcast, "I fought for a country that told me I mattered. But when the water rose, they told me I was too expensive to rescue." International attention followed. The United Nations released a statement of grave concern over the systemic racialization of disaster response. Human Rights Watch launched an independent audit. Even allies in Canada and Germany issued remarks condemning the ethical implications of economically stratified survival. No one used the word genocide, not yet, but the subtext was unavoidable. What happened in Bay Ridge was not just a tragedy, it was an algorithmic purge of the powerless. Back in Washington, Stephen Miller did not appear in public. For 5 days, his office issued no statement. He was seen once behind the tinted windows of a government SUV, escorted by private security into an underground garage. But the silence did not serve him. It drowned him. Former allies began distancing themselves on cable news, calling the language in the leaked recordings unacceptable, un-American, a deviation from our values. His once proud defenders started framing him as a lone actor, an administrative extremist, a rogue advisor with too much discretion. Privately, Republican strategists panicked. The scandal was metastasizing, threatening to taint unrelated legislation, upcoming midterm races, and campaign donors. A document leaked from a conservative super PAC revealed internal polling that showed a 22-point trust drop in federal emergency management among suburban voters. Wealthy districts weren't proud of how they'd been prioritized. They were afraid of being seen, and no one, not even the beneficiaries of the disaster's selective mercy, wanted to be aligned with the logic of human discard. Through all of it, Jasmine Crockett remained strikingly quiet. No late-night interviews, No celebratory podiums. Her team posted one statement: "Accountability is not a trend, it is a duty. We owe the truth to the dead and the fight to the living." Inside her office, she reviewed the list of confirmed commission members: legal scholars, emergency response veterans, civil rights historians. It was not a symbolic committee. It was a crucible, a chamber built not to contain the truth, but to expose it. Her office also received over 1,400 letters from children. Many included drawings, houses on stilts, boats rescuing families, a stick figure with glasses labeled Jasmine. One letter written in blue marker on lined paper simply read, "Tell them to never do that again." The date of Miller's second testimony was set for prime time, 8 p.m. on a Thursday night. It would be televised live across every major network, preempting sports, scripted television, and political debate shows. It would have sign language interpreters, Spanish language coverage, and simulcasts in shelters across the Gulf Coast. The commission released a statement: "This hearing is not about vengeance. It is about national conscience." Outside the Capitol, the plaza was no longer a protest zone. It had become something closer to sacred ground. Makeshift memorials dotted the stone steps. Candles, notes, water bottles with red crosses drawn in Sharpie, rain-soaked photos of those who never made it out. Some visitors stood in silence. Others prayed. A child sat with a crayon, coloring the words "We Matter" on cardboard as his mother adjusted his hoodie against the wind. And somewhere inside the Capitol, under guarded hallways and marble floors, Stephen Miller prepared to testify again, not just before a committee, but before a country that had seen past the numbers. A country that had heard the tape, seen the maps, watched the faces. A country that could no longer pretend that indifference was accidental. This time the questions would be sharper, the room colder, the nation less willing to forgive. And above it all, one truth echoed louder than policy, louder than politics, louder than any defense Miller could prepare. This time the reckoning had a name, and it was already knocking at the door. And as the date of Miller's testimony drew near, as the storm inside Washington raged louder than any hurricane that had torn through the Gulf, there was one place that did not wait for justice to be handed down. One place that refused to remain a footnote in someone else's hearing room. Bay Ridge, the forgotten, the flooded, the redlined and rerouted, began to rise, not in brick or steel, but in defiance. They were no longer simply survivors of policy. They were architects of resistance. And the world began to notice. The town had once been a dot on a FEMA report, color-coded in crimson and labeled non-viable. Its streets had once echoed only with the sound of abandoned rescue calls and unanswered prayers. But now they pulsed with movement. Volunteers rebuilding homes from salvaged lumber, artists painting murals on boarded-up storefronts, mothers organizing water distribution from the back of church vans. Journalists who once flew in for 30-second storm clips now returned to document something rare: the birth of a civic awakening. The people of Bay Ridge weren't asking for pity. They weren't even asking for help. They were asking for the country to look them in the eye and see them. What made Bay Ridge extraordinary wasn't the size of its loss, but the clarity of its voice. Residents began hosting community forums under tents lit by generator-powered floodlights. Local teenagers printed pamphlets explaining what recovery by tax bracket really meant. Clergy members rewrote Sunday sermons, not just to comfort, but to arm their congregants with knowledge. "This is not just about weather," one minister said through a crackling megaphone. "This is about the storm of decisions that came after." And in cities across America, protesters began holding signs that simply read, "We are all Bay Ridge now." It wasn't long before footage of Bay Ridge's transformation began airing alongside coverage of the National Commission hearings. News anchors juxtaposed images of elite lawmakers in polished chambers, with children in Bay Ridge organizing mobile clinics from school buses stripped of seats. Donations began to pour in, not from corporations, but from people. Cash mailed in envelopes from retired postal workers, handwritten checks from school teachers, coins collected by children at lemonade stands. They didn't send money because Bay Ridge was broken. They sent it because Bayridge had stood up when others bowed. And through all of it, Jasmine Crockett returned, not as a headline, not as a soundbite, but as a witness to something greater than policy, human resilience. She walked the streets again, not escorted by cameras this time, but by neighbors who had once huddled in the dark, waiting for aid that never came. She visited the shelter where she had first met Malik, the boy who lost his father, and asked the question that shook the nation. She sat beside him in silence, holding his hand as he stared at the empty lot where his home once stood. No words, just the steady, unspoken promise of someone who refused to forget. And on a cloudless morning, weeks after the hearings began, but long before the judgment was complete, Jasmine stood once more in Bayridge. This time not in a hearing room, but in the ashes of what had been, in the roots of what was coming. Behind her, the skeletal remains of a school gymnasium where 15 families had once taken shelter in the flood. In front of her, a crowd of hundreds, not just Bayridge residents, but survivors from across the country who had come to stand with them. The ground beneath them was still scarred, the walls still crumbled, but the people were unshakable. She stepped up onto the cracked foundation of the collapsed gym and waited until the crowd fell silent. No microphones, no teleprompters, just her voice, hoarse but resolute. "I've been in rooms where the powerful measure lives in spreadsheets," she began, "where they talk about communities like assets and pain like inconvenience. I've heard them say some neighborhoods aren't worth saving. I've seen them point to maps and call it logic. But what they forgot was you." The crowd stood still, locked in the gravity of every word. "They forgot that communities are not numbers," she said. "They are names. They are histories. They are generations of dignity you can't bulldoze or budget away. They thought you wouldn't speak, that you wouldn't stand, that you wouldn't fight. But Bayridge, you did. You spoke when they erased you. You stood when they dismissed you. And now the whole country is watching because you made them see what they tried so hard to ignore." She paused, and in the silence that followed, a single bird called from a collapsed tree. The breeze tugged gently at her coat. Then, with eyes scanning the crowd, from elders in wheelchairs to children holding candles made from melted wax in plastic cups, Jasmine delivered the final words that would echo beyond the borders of this town, into textbooks and courtrooms and every neighborhood that had ever been left behind. "We will not rebuild Bayridge with concrete alone," she said, voice ringing across the lot. "We will rebuild it with justice. Because bricks can fall, roads can flood, but dignity endures when the world finally chooses to see." The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in something more powerful. Silence held in shared understanding, then rising moment by moment into applause, not for survival, but for refusal. Refusal to disappear. Refusal to be priced, ranked, or redlined. Refusal to accept that mercy is something earned only by wealth. And as Jasmine stepped down from the rubble and into the people, as the sun climbed higher over the ruins, Bayridge no longer looked like a city that had been failed. It looked like the place where failure ended, not because it was spared, but because it dared to speak. And as Bayridge's ragged applause melted into quiet resolve, the moment's raw electricity begged a single question. What lesson remains after the floodlights dim and the world's attention drifts elsewhere? The first truth Bayridge carved into the nation's conscience was savage in its simplicity. Disaster relief that discriminates by tax bracket is not mismanagement, but sanctioned abandonment. A revelation that shattered the polite fiction of neutral bureaucracy and exposed the dangerous arithmetic hiding beneath the phrase cost-benefit. It taught every mayor, banker, and budget director that the instant human life is reduced to a line item, democracy fractures at its moral seams. Malik's unanswered question, whether a richer father would have been saved, echoed in living rooms and city halls, forcing comfortable audiences to feel the sting of a calculus that deems poverty an acceptable casualty. Jasmine saw with excruciating clarity that silence is the dirt where injustice flowers. Once that soil is tilled with testimony and evidence, complacency can no longer hide behind ignorance. Bayridge showed that the first casualty of selective rescue is trust, and when trust dies, No levy of propaganda can hold back the flood of disillusionment surging in its wake. In classrooms, teachers replayed footage of the hearings to illustrate civics, but what the students actually studied was moral physics. The way indifference exerts crushing pressure on the lives least able to bear it. Pastors quoted Jasmine's indictment from pulpits normally reserved for softer epistles, reminding congregants that faith without the works of justice is just sanctified apathy. The moral summons was unmistakable. If a government's ledger can erase entire zip codes, then every citizen's duty is to pick up a pen, dipped in outrage, and rewrite the terms of belonging. The second lesson Berridge offered was that solidarity begins where sympathy ends. Sympathy watches tragedy on a screen and whispers, "Poor souls," while solidarity steps into the wreckage and asks, "What must change so this never happens again?" When volunteers trucked pallets of bottled water across state lines without waiting for federal directives, they revealed a communal muscle long neglected by booster shot patriotism, a resolve to act without permission when permission becomes a death sentence. Grandmothers who had never used social media before learned to live stream distribution lines, broadcasting the truth faster than any press secretary could contain it. Street artists painted murals of drowned houses, sprouting phoenix wings, transforming graffiti-stained cinder blocks into billboards of defiance that tourists photographed and shared until Bayridge's story circled the globe. Musicians held rooftop concerts on half-collapsed porches, their lyrics weaponizing melody into protest, and retuning national ears to frequencies of grief mainstream radio refused to play. Librarians converted ruined branches into pop-up research hubs, teaching residents how to file public records requests so the next whistleblower would not stand alone. That groundswell of neighbor-to-neighbor deliverance broadcast an indictment more potent than any hearing. If ordinary citizens can outpace $1 trillion emergency apparatus, then something corrosive lives in the gap between taxpayer trust and governmental response. In that gap, Berridge planted the seed of a new social contract, one watered by collective vigilance and pruned by the refusal to assume someone else will fix what everyone sees as broken. Solidarity, Berridge insisted, is not charity, it is survival's true infrastructure. The third insight flared like lightning inside every newsroom scrambling to keep pace. Stories become catalysts only when they pierce data's numbing haze, with faces and names that refuse to be anonymized. No graph could compete with the image of Horace Freeman's oxygen tank hissing empty beside his body, or Rosa Morales rocking her silent infant, while bureaucrats debated metrics of fiscal sustainability. Bayridge proved that statistics inform but narratives ignite, and once ignited, outrage can combust into policy faster than lobbyists can smother the flame. Journalists, long chastised for bias, discovered that moral clarity is not bias but ballast when the ship of state lists toward cruelty disguised as thrift. Editorial boards that once hedged every condemnation behind both sides, phrasing abandoned faux balance, and printed words like engineered neglect, transforming caution into conviction. Meanwhile, student reporters live-streamed block by block testimonies so visceral they shattered the sanitized language of official press releases, forcing network anchors to reevaluate the calculus of ratings versus responsibility. In every broadcast booth, producers realized that showing 20 seconds of storm debris without context is voyeurism, but staying on the air until complacency cracks is public service. Thus, the human story lens became a scalpel, slicing through spreadsheets to reveal the bleeding bodies beneath. And once viewers saw the wound, they demanded more than bandages. They demanded accountability. Bayridge taught the storytellers of America that journalism's highest calling is not to chronicle power, but to confront it. Fourth, Bayridge exposed the perilous myth that democracy can outsource compassion to algorithms. The predictive models that redline entire neighborhoods as low-yield recovery zones were built not by villains twirling mustaches, but by consultants brandishing neutral language. Yet neutrality without conscience is just prejudice in spreadsheet form. When Jasmine flung those color-coded maps under the hearing room lights, she detonated the illusion that tech-driven efficiency is inherently fair, showing instead how data inherits the biases of those who feed it. Programmers watching the scandal unfold realized that code is never just math. It is moral philosophy written in syntax, capable of uplifting or erasing lives at machine speed. Universities added emergency ethics modules to computer science curricula overnight, teaching budding developers that every line they write can become a lifeline or a noose. Venture capitalists funding civic tech startups were called before investor boards to explain how optimization might translate to triage by wealth. Government agencies scrambled to audit automated decision systems, terrified that the next leak might reveal racialized algorithms buried deep in disaster protocols across the nation. In Silicon Valley, workers stage internal petitions demanding human-first kill switches for any software determining resource allocation. Bay Ridge forced a reckoning between cold computation and hot humanity, proving that if we do not encode empathy, the future will execute injustice flawlessly. The fifth lesson, perhaps the most stinging, was that privileges insulated by geography are illusions once floodwaters rise. Suburban families who watch Bay Ridge's suffering through distance-fog compassion suddenly realize their own manicured lawns could be next on the chopping block if a cost-benefit chart ever labeled them inefficient. Property values trembled not from market fluctuations, but from moral contagion, the fear that a government willing to discard Bay Ridge might one day discard any place whose returns dipped below threshold. Insurance companies, sensitive to reputational risk, began pressuring state legislatures for transparent, equity-based disaster plans lest premiums spike amid public distrust. Homeowner associations printed copies of Jasmine's testimony and marched them into city council meetings, demanding audits of emergency protocols. What had begun as a localized tragedy metastasized into a nationwide movement for baseline guarantees. Minimum response times, uniform triage standards, real-time public reporting of aid deployment. Politicians first tried to placate with photo ops, but the electorate now recognized that a ribbon cut is not a life raft, and a promise without statute is just breath. The ripple effect reached corporate boardrooms, where risk analysts updated climate impact models to include social justice fallout, because reputational damage now traveled faster than hurricanes across global supply chains. Bay Ridge reminded comfortable enclaves that injustice, once normalized, migrates like a storm cloud. No gated community can wall off the moral weather forever. The land behind every white picket fence suddenly felt a little less secure. Sixth, Bay Ridge illuminated an uncomfortable paradox. Meaningful change requires both institutional power and grassroots pressure. And when either half wavers, the whole machine seizes. Jasmine wielded evidence like artillery, but without the marching feet, the viral hashtags, the unrelenting public clamor, her documentation might have languished in subcommittee purgatory. Conversely, without her strategic deployment of leaks and subpoenas, public fury could have roared itself hoarse against an impregnable wall of procedural delay. Their synergy became a blueprint. Activists supplied moral voltage while lawmakers rerouted that current into legislative circuitry. City planners took note, drafting participatory budgeting pilots that embed citizen oversight into infrastructure decisions. Nonprofits mined Bay Ridge's model to develop crisis co-ops, networks ready to mobilize resources and political pressure within hours of future catastrophes. Universities documented the movement for case studies, teaching students that history's hinge moments are forged where street passion meets savvy policymaking. The lesson was crystal. Hearts alone cannot rebuild systems, and systems alone cannot heal hearts. Only their fusion can forge durable reform. Bay Ridge became the living lab where that fusion was tested and proven. Seventh, the saga exposed how quickly complacency calcifies in corridors of comfort, and how urgently leaders must cultivate moral imagination equal to their fiscal imagination. Budget hawks who once boasted of trimming waste discovered that the bloodless term often masked real, breathing people. Some publicly renounced austerity dogmas after walking Bay Ridge's streets. A handful of CEOs redirected corporate philanthropy away from naming rights and into disaster equity endowments, acknowledging that reputational capital now hinges on tangible justice rather than glossy brochures. Yet Bay Ridge's elders warned Jasmine that conscience can wither once headlines fade, urging her to codify reforms before partisan winds shift. She responded by drafting the Equal Response Act, a sweeping bill mandating transparent allocation algorithms, real-time public dashboards, and punitive fines for agencies that prioritize wealth over vulnerability. Civic groups rallied behind the proposal, flooding representatives with daily calls until the legislation arrived on the House floor, backed by an unprecedented coalition of faith networks, labor unions, university associations, and small-town chambers of commerce. In those unlikely alliances, Berridge demonstrated that moral urgency can override ideological trenches, but only if leaders nurture that urgency before it dissipates. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.